Well, welcome everyone. We're excited to be here today. I think we have a really wonderful panel for you. And thanks so much, Mike, for the introduction. I think one of the exciting aspects of this webinar today is that we have three really great presenters who are coming from two of DFID's flagship programs that are pushing forward women's economic empowerment. So first, we're going to hear about the work and opportunities for women, the WOW kind of experience. And the objective of WOW you'll hear a little bit more about, but in its broader sense, WOW is working to improve access for economic opportunities through business interventions and supply chains and economic development programs, and is working across 35 DFID economic development programs, which is quite impressive. And we're going to hear from Stephanie Barrientos, who's a professor of global development from the University of Manchester and is also the research lead of WOW, and interestingly has recently published a book on gender and work and global value chains. So hopefully, Stephanie, at some point you can pop in the chat box how we can all get a hold of your book, because it sounds very relevant and interesting. And then secondly is the Arab Women's Enterprise Fund, like we like to call AWEF, which is the only market systems-based development program in the region of the Middle East that puts women's economic empowerment at the core of its objectives and impacts. And today we're going to hear from Julia Hakspiel, who's a managing consultant for MarketShare and also the learning lead for AWEF, as well as Adriano Scarampi, who's the advisory practice lead for MarketShare and also a technical market systems lead for AWEF. So just before I turn it over to Stephanie to get into some of the details, I just want to frame the issue because I think this is a really, really important discussion today. So, not only do these programs share this focus on we, but I think it's important to point out that they both share a focus on working in a co-creative way with the private sector, as well as applying data-driven approaches to decision-making and learning. And I know, given that many of us on this webinar today are market systems practitioners, I know that a lot of us also deeply understand the need for good as well as fast data to help our market systems work. So good data helps us to learn, adapt, and pivot in order to effectively strengthen the systems we work in to be more inclusive. And we know there are data gaps, as we all know, across market systems work in many different ways. But I truly believe that the data gaps are particularly acute when you're working to empower women economically. So there are multiple reasons for this, which I think you'll hear a lot from the different presenters, but I think one overarching important point is about how to make women's work more visible. And I think for us to do our jobs, we need to have better data about women's and men's roles and more detail about how they engage in our targeted market systems. So for example, in the agriculture sector, there remains common misperceptions about women's roles in agribusiness. And these misperceptions have a direct impact on how we design our programs. Women actually play a significant role in agribusiness across many contexts, but it can go unacknowledged as part of domestic chores, as a lot of us know. But the difference in women being unacknowledged versus actually being underrepresented in certain value chains is actually a very important distinction and something we all need to be aware of and need to be thinking about and collecting better data because they have very unique programming consequences. So I think collecting better data can help us to understand these critical distinctions and better meet women where they're at with gender smart data and adaptive programming. So with that, I'm going to stop, but I really hope you enjoy these presentations today because I think both of these programs have done some really cutting edge work on collecting data in different ways and also making women's work more visible and therefore more impactful. So with that, Stephanie, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Erin, and welcome and great to be part of this webinar, which is very important in terms of promoting up women's participation. I should say that I'm going to focus very much on a global value chain perspective. I've worked on gender and global value chains for over 20 years in manufacturing, agribusiness, personal care, and other sectors in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So it's what I understand and know best, and I will go into that in more detail in a minute. If we just think for a second about WOW, I was just going to say a few words about the DFID Work and Opportunities for Women program, which is one of DFID's flagship programs. And it's a 5-year program involving a collaboration between a number of organizations, including BSR, Care International, Social Development Direct, and others. And the goal is to enhance the economic empowerment of 300,000 women working in global value chains, and particularly with aiming to achieve that goal through supporting and collaboration with businesses, organizations, and other programs that are already engaged in this space, very much trying to enable the different actors across the value chain to drive change, and then also to influence the UK agenda on women's economic empowerment, but with a very specific focus on global value chains, where we feel that it's been, on the whole, or not completely, but often been ignored in the past. So moving on, in terms of how we're planning to do that, how WOW is organised. We're divided into four outputs or four dimensions. The first is establishing partnerships with lead companies and other organizations linked to the private sector who are engaged in global value chains and are directly involved with suppliers and workers and smallholders, where a large number of particularly are women. And I'll go into that in more detail in a minute. The second part is on research, and I lead the research dimension. And what we're doing is really trying to understand better what the data gaps are, and how we can improve data information and therefore in transparency on the work that women actually do in global value chains. There's also a help desk, which provides information on requests, particularly for DFID and DFID partners. And then there is a WOW fund, which supports specific partnerships led by other organizations. So carrying on, I was asked just to say a little bit about global value chains, and particularly how you can differentiate global value chains from a market systems development approach. And I think there are definitely important overlaps between the two, but I think there are also differences. So I've done it just with a very simple graphic at the top. So if you think of a global value chain, the essence of a global value chain is that the linkages between inputs, production, distribution, and retail are not simply driven by traditional supply and market type supply and demand or import-export type arrangements. They are coordinated, pre-programmed, and pre-planned by the lead firm, and the lead firm could be a retailer, or it could be a large agri-food company, or it could even be a very large manufacturer. And they coordinate the distribution, production, and inputs backwards, often well in advance. So an example I've got in that graphic would be garments. So if we think of garments which are retailed in the UK, that retail will be coordinated backwards through the whole distribution channel, through to the production, which, for example, could be in Bangladesh. The Bangladesh suppliers will be given orders well in advance with a very, very high level of detail specified, and then even coordinated back to the cotton or other inputs, which could be in a different country altogether, for example, India. So a global value chain can cross a whole series of countries, in this case, India, Bangladesh, Panama, Rotterdam, and the UK, but are coordinated by the lead retailer or the lead firm from beginning to end. So they're not simply a kind of market through traditional market interaction. And then linking that back into a business enabling environment, each of those segments of the value chain itself is embedded in the business enabling environment of the country within which the production takes place. But at the same time, there are linkages between all of those BEEs, as I call them, and the final retail retailer. I'll come back to that because that's very important for the gender perspective. Global value chains are the DNA of any large company, any large business that trades internationally will work or can think through in terms of global value chains. They are primarily consumer focused. You start with the consumer and then you work backwards as to what you order, what you want to buy. They're buyer driven, and they're very importantly, the governance of the large firms is focused on quality, cost, and consistency, and those three are absolutely sacrosanct. And quality can be product quality, social quality, and environmental quality. In contrast, the market systems development approach is more poor focus. That's the kind of driver, if you like, and particularly giving market access for poorer producers. And then a lot of the investment and the focus is in enhancing that business enabling environment. So you can see that there's overlap between the two, they interconnect. It's just really work coming at those two from a slightly different direction. And I think in the future, working out how they could be better linked, and I'll come back to that later. So just very briefly, the latest World Development Report is focused on global value chains and trade, so anyone interested in this should certainly consult that. And what the data there shows is that there has been a steady increase in trade through global value chains, slightly tailed off since the financial crisis, but currently, and the data varies, it's somewhere between 55 and 80% of world trade goes through value chains. Very importantly, though, what we don't have is good data on workers in global value chains, and we don't especially have good gender data. The OECD TIVA is one of the main sources of data. There are other organizations, ILO as well, and it's estimated that 40 OECD countries have about 453 million jobs linked into global value chains. 42% of those are female, but very importantly, that excludes lower income countries, lower tiers of the value chain, which don't enter in as trading companies, casual workers, seasonal workers, and smallholders. And as you'll see in a minute, that is where women are largely concentrated. Therefore, they're really not showing up significantly in the data. So then just to think a bit more about the gender dimension of global value chain. So I'm going back to a similar graphic, but what I want to just think through now, or talk through in a little bit more detail, is how how women are linked into the value chain. So if you think of a value chain being the connections between or the interlinkages between inputs, production, distribution, retail, through to the final consumer or customer, because that's where the primary focus is. Each of those segments will be embedded in a local labour market. Now, those segments could be in different countries, and in a simplified version, I had them as different countries. They could also be within the same country, but different parts of either inputs or segments of the value chain, for example, in the inputs or production. But in each case, in a simplified form, what we need to remember very clearly is that the BEE or the production is embedded in the local labour market, and that local labour market is highly gendered, and the social norms, etc., which configure that local labour market will affect how women are engaged in work in the global value chain, as well as the kinds of demands that have been put on the global value chain by the lead firms, the retailers, or the large manufacturers. The World Development Report cites the information very well that on the whole, research indicates that global value chains deliver better jobs than more traditional markets, but the employment is complex. On the whole, global value chains employ more women than traditional production for local markets or more market-led trade, and in that sense also contributes to poverty reduction by raising incomes, especially including for women. But, and again, a very big but, the data and information that we do have, which is partial, indicates that women are really, that the gains are distributed unequally, both within countries and between countries, and very importantly, that there's a significant gender glass ceiling that predominates in value chains. So just to think who it is we're thinking about, if we're going through all levels of the value chain, at the upper tiers of a value chain on the right-hand side of the pictures, you've got a garment manufacturer, agri-food exporter. Those are the firms that will show up as export firms. And there you tend to have much more mechanized types of work, but also quite, certainly in these two sectors and in many others, a significant proportion of those are women. It varies between country. But if you think backwards into the lower tiers, you've also got inputs coming in to the value chain, could be from informal workers, often home-based workers, from small-scale agriculture, often family-based, with women working as contributing family labour. So effectively, there's quite a kind of overlap or interconnection, if you like, between the productive work that women do and the reproductive work, their other roles in the household, etc. I haven't got time to go into detail, but this is really kind of a visualization of the interconnections between the value chain and women's different roles as paid and unpaid workers. So carrying on now, thinking through a bit more in relation to the data gaps. And having worked in this space for a very long time, trying to get data is enormously difficult. What this slide shows is is an illustrative, very important illustrative gender mapping of an agri-food value chain. The data comes from multiple sources. It's in my book, which is Gender and Working, Global Value Chains, Capturing the Gains, published late last year by Cambridge University Press. And in there are all the data sources are explained in some detail. So this is just a very quick snapshot. But if we think of all the consumers, on the whole, consumers are both male and female, and that'll be based on the proportion of the gender ratio in the population. The vast majority purchasing, the customer, is primarily female. For example, 70%, even in some places, 80 countries, 80%. Depends, especially of final consumer products. It will vary by product, but one leading retailer in the UK tells me that 60% of all male shirts are bought by women. So clearly, there's quite a strong gender focus. But when we go through the agri-food value chain and think of it at the different levels, at the board level of all the companies that are involved in agriculture, in processing, in the agents, in logistics, the retailers, the board and senior management are primarily male. And the numbers vary, significant between company and country, but well over 55% will be male, often even more like 70 or 80%. As you go on down at the supervisor and permanent worker level, again, across agriculture, manufacture, intermediary agents, logistics, you'll get men and women working, but men tend to be the majority, except in retail itself. So in retail itself, the shops, you'll tend to have a higher proportion, or more of a balance, if you like, anyway, between. But as you move to the lower tiers, temporary part-time work, smallholders, labour contractors, the data gets much more difficult to find, much more based on case studies than systematic data. But what we find is that women play a significant role in those lower tiers. And if you take the example of smallholder farming, if you look at farmers, the majority will be male. If you look at the work done on the farm contributing family labour, much research indicates that that is primarily female, and certainly the vast majority of home-based workers are female. But this is just illustrative only. As I say, the book has a lot more detail. So with the DFID WOW program, what we've been trying to do is to obtain better data and information. The research part, we've been working very closely with 3 companies, really working with the kind of all the data they have on their supply chain, different sources of data. And just to give you a kind of a snapshot overview of the challenges that we found at different levels. Firstly, there are various data sources. Suppliers hold data, the buyer sourcing companies hold data. There's a lot of data held on social compliance platforms. A number of initiatives have monitoring M&E, and ILO, OECD, TIVA, they're working on trying to get better data. But even though where the data is often collected, the recording of the data that is collected is often fragmented or inaccessible. So supplier data is confidential, there are discrepancies between different data sources. Audit data, for example, social auditors go in and collect data, but only a limited amount of that ever goes onto the platform, and it's often overwritten if new data comes up. And also there are often discrepancies between the different sources of data. So the reporting gets even poorer still, partly because of confidentiality, but partly because different initiatives use different types of data, ask different questions, so there's a lack of consistency. So in WOW, working with the 3 companies, we've been trying to do more systematic gender mappings of the value chain than the illustrative mapping I showed you earlier. So where we're getting really hard data rather than just estimates from multiple different sources. And we found that there is a lot of data there. Social compliance, this is social auditing, has not been particularly good at identifying gender discrimination. In fact, it's been quite poor. But auditors do collect a lot of gender disaggregated information, and that data and information is an important source of understanding where women are, what kind of work women are doing. And certainly the social compliance platforms and programs are becoming much more aware of the need to have gender disaggregated data. So for example, SEDEX, which is one of the largest social auditing platforms, has recently established a gender working group and is seeking to improve the gender sensitivity of the data that they collect and they record and they report. Companies themselves, we've been working with 3 companies looking at the supplier data that they have. And again, in a lot of those supplier data systems, and they do vary, there is quite a lot of data, and the suppliers themselves are in a position to provide more data if asked. But it's quite variable. It varies by company. They have different types of systems. So therefore, using the social compliance data of these 3 companies and their own sourcing data, data sets and data systems, we have been able to do gender mappings for each of the companies with much more concrete information. Those aren't yet publicly available, but we are planning to publish in the future, where we'll be able to actually provide more information on the research that we've done. But just to highlight a couple of things that we've been able to find. Firstly, if you take garments, one of the countries where we've really dug down deep, not just at the aggregate level, but right the way down the value chain, has been Bangladesh garments. What we found is that there are very rapidly shifting gender ratios, so the ratio of women is declining relative to men. Absolute numbers is increasing, but the reason behind that is also heavily linked in with the switch from labour-intensive woven to more mechanised knitwear, and we've been able to demonstrate that through more detailed analysis of data. A lot of emphasis is on leadership and trying to promote women in the value chain. But when we've really broken down the data, we found there are blockages. And finally, in agri-food, again, a lot of invisibility of women at smallholder level, But if you really trace through using traceability data, you will find a lot more data and information than is available at higher levels of the value chain. So data is collected, and when you can access that data, it can be quite informative of the roles that women play. So just to the final slide. So this is ongoing work. We're just completing our second year of the DFID WOW program. We're about to move into the third year. There will be publications coming out at a later stage. But really, I think what the research is showing is, firstly, that gender invisibility is a critical problem. There are significant gaps. And clearly, what data and information we have show that there are systemic gender glass ceilings. But as so well known, if you can't see the problem, you can't address the problem, and therefore we have to have greater visibility to be able to work out strategies going forward. Some companies are definitely committing to that. An example is Marks and Spencer's in the UK has a Plan A commitment to strive for 25% of management in their main suppliers being female by 2023. So there are clear commitments. Other companies are working on similar commitments, but we have a long way to go. There is evidence as well of scaling up, and to scale up, companies cannot do this on their own. They have to do particularly work on gender through collaboration, working with others. But what we need is more cohesion so that everybody is looking for similar data, at least a core part of the data. And there's been work going on that on the Gender Data and Impact Framework, GDI framework, led by BSR, working with a number of different stakeholders, including ICEAL, UN Women, ETI, and others, trying to get more coherent data. So there is a lot of collaboration going on, and certainly WOW has been playing an important role in that, in terms of helping to network. And then just finally, just really running home the message that this is so good for business, good for women, and good for sustainable development that will all benefit from
it. Thank you so much, Stephanie. I know we're running a little bit over, so I want to switch it over quickly to Julia. I think is starting off, and hopefully Julia and Adriano, you can get through, and we can make sure we leave some time for questions.
Great. Thanks, Erin. Hi, everyone. My name is Julia Hakspiel. I'm a managing consultant with MarketShare and the learning manager for the Arab Women's Enterprise Fund. As Erin has mentioned, the Middle East and North Africa is the region with the lowest rates of female economic participation in the world. So the goal of AWEF is to increase economic opportunities and well-being for 150,000 poor women in Egypt and Jordan through a market systems approach. We measure our impact through two angles: access to increased income and markets for women, but also improved agency for women, which we define as improved voice, choice, and control that women have over their surroundings and the market systems that they interact with. So there are a number of ways in which we use data to understand women's roles in the market systems that we work in, as well as the constraints and opportunities they face, and then how we can address or leverage these to create systemic change. During the design stage of AWEF, we of course relied on a number of data points that allowed us to select target sectors based on their relevant growth potential and feasibility. We also use the design stage to identify binding constraints to women's economic empowerment from both the perspective of the women, but also the market actor perspective. And this allowed us to identify viable business models or practices that had potential to unlock business benefits for some of our market actor partners, but also create potential impact for women's economic empowerment. In implementation, we also consistently use light touch monitoring to capture data that can enable us to verify some of our initial assumptions and intervention logic. And then we also use data for replication. We have sought to document the commercial results of some of our interventions and use this business case to encourage replication by other market actors within the value chains that we work in. And finally, we use data to capture systemic change within the market, something my colleague Adriano will talk a bit more about in a minute. I'll now talk through very briefly our intervention in the Egyptian ready-made garment sector and how we have particularly applied steps 1 and 3 in this context. So in Egypt, we decided to focus on the ready-made garment sector for a number of reasons. It's a strategic sector for the national economy and contributes significantly to exports and the balance of payments of the country. And it's also one of the sectors in the economy that already employs a high proportion of women. However, women's workforce participation in the sector was only 45%, as opposed to the global benchmark of 80%. And this was one of the main contributors to the low productivity of the sector, as Egyptian firms were struggling to hire and retain female talent, which is particularly well suited to this type of work. We also conducted some interviews with factory workers and supervisors and managers, and realized that the number of reasons women left the factory was poor treatment by their supervisor. So there was really a clear rationale for selecting the sector, both in terms of the potential impact we could have on women, but also the business constraints that we could help address. So based on our analysis, we piloted 2 sets of interventions. We first focused on creating new formal gender-sensitive recruitment channels and linking the RMG firms to firms providing these services. Some of the new practices we introduced were things like women-only job fairs or female recruitment teams going out into the local communities and particularly targeting women. The second was linking RMG firms to trained providers of supervisory skills training to improve how supervisors were interacting and treating female workers in the factories. We piloted our intervention with Arafa, which was chosen for a number of reasons. It's one of the largest RMG exporters and employers in the country. So any new practices that they would adopt would hopefully quickly become the new market standard and would be replicated by other firms. This graph shows some of the business results that we were able to document from our intervention with Arafa. The intervention generated annual savings of nearly 2 million Egyptian pounds for the firm, equivalent to about 120,000 US dollars. And this was as a result of improvement in the turnover rate, reduced absenteeism, also less time spent managing disputes on the factory floor, which in turn improved productivity and quality of work, and also improved business performance in audits performed by Arafa's buyers, linking to what Stephanie presented earlier. One of the more interesting and unexpected results was that Arafa's reputation as a good employer significantly increased referral-based recruitment. So women were more likely to recommend the job to other women because they felt safer and better treated within the workplace. We have also used this graphic to present some of these results to Arafa senior management, but also other firms in the sector through dissemination events we have held to encourage scaling and replication, and by really showcasing some of these commercial benefits that these business practices can bring about. And we have also documented our experience of developing this business case, as well as case studies from 17 other case studies from the wider practitioner community in a learning brief, which we published last year. I won't speak in detail about the brief, but it presents a range of frameworks, approaches, data and metrics that can be used to build a compelling business case to the private sector around women's economic empowerment interventions. So if you're interested in the brief, I'll pop the link in the chat box and you can read it in your own time. I'll now pass over to my colleague Adriano, who will speak about our Jordan intervention.
So I'll I'll spend the next 5 minutes or so just briefly talking through some of the work that we have done in Jordan and how we use data to just strengthen our implementation all the way. I will talk about three bubbles from Judith's slide: the analyze, monitor, and learn, and measure systemic change elements of using data. So first of all, just wanted to how we use data at the very beginning of the program. As we were trying to, as we were participating on the program, we're trying to understand where to really intervene in the system. So we use some combination of high-level macroeconomic data as well as in-depth field research to try to understand opportunities for intervention. And here, just wanted to share with you some really key high-level figures that pointed us towards a particular area of the system. Low levels of participation, high percentage of the population working informally, and then we found some particular products that had a particular high female participation, such as the production of jamid, which is a local dairy product. And then we also found some additional constraints related to female, to women financial inclusion.
That led us to prioritizing a lot of work in this space of home-based dairy
prospecting as well as financial inclusion. What I wanted to tell you a little bit about is how we have used some of the data as we were implementing to relearn and pivot our interventions to make them more effective to our target population. Specifically in the licensing intervention, which was a particular intervention that we designed for the dairy subsector, realizing that women were primarily working informally as part of our strategy to upgrade their production. We rolled out a licensing system at the municipality level for home-based processors. Realizing that the licensing process was not actually being taken up by women as much as we would have liked, we straight away we launched a series of research activities, focus group discussions, interviews with local women entrepreneurs to understand why the uptake was so low. Those early discussions and the use of this qualitative data really led us to the identification of 3 additional constraints that then really allowed us to pivot our interventions. On one side, there was very little awareness of the potential of the licensing process and the business case from the women's perspective. We learned that women were there was a fear of formalization and the burden of taxation if they were to formalize. And then there was also the fear of losing some social security benefits that were tied to their status as non-economically active. So this data collection, these interviews, this finger on the pulse on the system effectively led to the design of 3 additional interventions. One around establishing a series of role models across 5 pilot municipalities to really share the role model women entrepreneurs, to really share the awareness and prove the case for investing into the licensing process from the women's perspective. We set up a partnership with the tax authority to strengthen the knowledge around taxation and tax breaks for micro entrepreneurs. And we initiated discussions with the Ministry of Social Development to create a bit of a grace period for women entrepreneurs to not give up their the social security. Moving on, I wanted to tell you a little bit about how we use data to, I guess, understand systemic change and really help us strengthening the sustainability and systemic effect of our interventions. First of all, to give you an overview, we conceptualize systemic change as systemic as those interventions that lead to 3 different things. One is market actor change, so the uptake of new practices at the market actor level, and that could also refer to rules and regulations. Those interventions need to have to have an impact on our target population. And then those are those interventions that also drive a change in informal rules. And informal rules is what I want to spend 1 or 2 minutes talking about. Informal rules are a bit of a very conceptual, I guess, concept, but to us are really those rules that keep, those unwritten rules that keep the change that we're driving honest and in check. They are those expectations among the target population that, for example, in the case of licensing, that municipalities are expected to provide licensing services specifically to women. It's a recognition from the target population, an informal recognition that it's a type of product that is expected to be provided, a type of services. Informal rules are also social norms to an extent, actually, definitely as well. And really understanding how these informal rules are driven by our interventions. And sense checking really allows us to sense check if there is more that we can do to really make the intervention sustainable. On this note, I'm going to skip on the final slide, which was just talking a little bit about some of the lessons learned from collecting data. And I think I'm just going to move to pass on the mic to Erin to wrap up and then move to Q&A, since I think it's good to save at least 15 minutes for that, ideally.
Great, thank you, Adriano. I'm trying to make sure I can switch to the Q&A slide. I don't know, maybe you can help me with that. I do just want to make sure I can publish these questions and get right into that, since we have 15 more minutes. So first, Stephanie, I might turn to you with a question that we were sent prior to the webinar, which I love that the Beatles team does that. It's so nice to get those questions in advance. See if people can do this right. I pressed publish, but I'm not seeing it. Is there a reason for that, maybe? Well,
sorry, the sound isn't very good. Could you just repeat the question again?
Oh shoot! I was just trying to publish it, and it wasn't working, but I think it is now.
All right,
so
okay.
Stephanie, if you look on the screen there was an interesting question about how to best connect some of the data on from the global value chain work that you've been doing with advocates and policy making. And maybe you could talk a little bit as if your program has been doing that and how that's been working.
Mm. Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I think the first thing is simply to talk to companies. I mean, this is where the data, the big companies have the best data access on global value chains and everything that goes on in their value chain, because they coordinate. So the first thing to do is simply to talk to them. Obviously, where you can exchange data with them, that's also very helpful. I think also very important to just remember the companies have enormous leverage. When a company asks its suppliers to promote more women to leadership positions, or to address sexual harassment, or whatever they might ask, suppliers listen, because this is a governed supply chain. So it is also a leverage point. So then the next question is using the data, how to connect that with advocates and policy making. There are certainly some policymakers who are very GVC value chain focused, and some examples would be the International Trade Center, GIZ. There are definitely some that have really, for a very long period of time, focused on the value chain, working with value chain actors, and engaging with them. But there are others, such as the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which now has a much more gender focus than it did previously. The World Benchmarking Alliance, which is working with companies in order to link their activities to the SDGs. So I think there are different levels. But I should also say, very importantly, some of the companies really understand now they have to know what goes on right the way down to the community level. Especially, I work a lot on cocoa. All the big chocolate companies have initiatives that are going on at local level, particularly in West Africa, which is where but most cocoa producing countries, and they work with local NGOs, local governments, etc., because they know they can't do this on their own. So I think there is increasing collaboration, but the data informs that collaboration, as has been indicated.
Stephanie, really appreciate that. I'm going to call next on, hold on 1 second here. sorry about this. Here we go. Publish. Sorry about this. That system's a little new for me. So I want to ask Adriano about working with farmers specifically, and what kind of data from women workers in the agribusiness industry do you need? And how can we, as facilitators, or I think they're calling it consultants, convince the companies to collect this data comprehensively? So how do we kind of co-create with the private sector to collect this data?
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Erin. I mean, first of all, I'm going to give a bit of a general answer and then pass on to Julia, who has a very practical example from a program in Mozambique. First of all, I think I'm going to pick on the last part of the question. How can we as consultants convince the companies to collect this data comprehensively? I think as consultants, we always need to strike the balance between what we need and what the company finds useful. If the company is going to collect some additional data, there needs to be a rationale that we really have to prove to them. I think it's very rare and not the most helpful to ask companies to collect data that they don't see value in it themselves. So if data aligns to their business incentives, to their business model, and it really allows them to understand to understand potential opportunities, then you have something powerful to play with. But that to me is really the starting point. And Julia, it would be great to hear a little bit about your experience in Mozambique.
So just to add, I think, to what Adriano said, something we explore a bit in our practitioner learning brief on making the business case, is I think when you're thinking about women workers in agribusiness industry, again, there's like different segments of women you can look at. So obviously there's perhaps workers in factories, but there also are female farmers who are acting as suppliers within those agricultural value chains. And then finally, there's also female farmers as consumers of inputs or other services and products offered within agricultural value chains. So I think depending on kind of which segment you're looking at, you would really cater the types of metrics and then the types of data you're interested in collecting to those segments. I can give one example from our Feed the Future program in Mozambique, which is funded by USAID and implemented by DEI and MarketShare Associates, where we have been working with input suppliers to put in place customer relationship management systems that track some of this data on farmer usage of inputs, what inputs farmers are buying, how often, how much, and this data is disaggregated by gender. It was a bit easier for us to make the case in investing in the system because the companies were already interested in investing in a system. So it was easy for us to sell to them that this data should also be gender disaggregated. But I think because we were able to align the metrics very closely with the KPIs the business was already tracking or interested in tracking better, it was a bit easier for us to make the case to them. And of course, the fact that we're able to cost share some of the investment in the system also kind of helps convince them of the value.
Another question here that's a bit of a follow-up, which is how have you seen the companies use that data? Can you talk a little bit about that, maybe from the ANOVA experience or some of the AWEF experience, in terms of how they've used it to support their own responsible business practices?
Sorry, Erin, I missed the first part of the question. I couldn't hear you.
Sorry, in terms of a follow-up, to maybe if you could expand upon, because there's another question here around how the businesses have used that data themselves to encourage responsible business practices.
Okay. I mean, I think with the input suppliers, we're still in quite early stages of that intervention, but our expectation is that essentially they'll use that data for improved customer analytics and then be able to better cater their products and services to the needs of the customers. So for example, there is kind of an assumption that women are not really purchasing inputs, particularly from the large input distributors. But when we talk to agro dealers or agro distributors on the ground, they actually say the majority of the customers are female. So this is one way of changing that perception for the kind of large input distributors high up the value chain, that they believe most of their customers are male, but actually in reality, many of them are female. And also just tailoring those products and services more, towards those different segments, and essentially improving their product offering. Under AWEF, we have been doing some similar work on digital financial services, and also working with some of the digital financial service providers in both Egypt and Jordan to improve kind of how they're doing analysis on customer data from a gender perspective, and using the analytics from that data to really improve the customer experience that women then have when using their digital financial services.
Great. Thank you. And Julia, this one might actually be directed at you again, but I think this is an interesting question. It kind of gets at the point around kind of the triple burden of women, but it also is kind of bringing it back to actually the impact on farm production. So in smallholder communities, aren't the families already maxed out, is what the question says. And if women diverted some of their time and effort to kind of other roles within the value chain, might that have a negative impact on farm production? And I was wondering, Julia, just to maybe reframe that a little bit, but I think it's an interesting question from kind of a gender perspective and a triple burden perspective. What types of activities have you seen that has helped to mitigate from those impacts? Uh-oh, Julia, did we lose you?
Yeah, Julia just had a power cut, so she's reconnecting.
Oh,
she's in
well, that's exciting. Well, maybe we can redirect it, unless, Adriano, you feel like you want to answer that. We can grab another question. Why don't we switch?
Yeah, let's grab another question, unless you have some thoughts too, Erin.
Yeah, I mean, I have some thoughts, but let's switch over because I'd rather hear from you guys. So with Christina also is asking up to have you describe more about how you're measuring systems change in the market. And I'm wondering, I know you talked through a slide, but I think it'd be interesting for people to hear kind of what are some of the, indicators and different ways that you're actually looking to measure, particularly the informal rules aspect of what you're looking at and what that looks like.
Yes, of course. So I think on AWEF specifically, we've tried to adopt a bit of a flexible way to measuring systems change. Ultimately, we see systems change as a continuum. It's not something that suddenly happens and you suddenly realize that you have achieved system change. To us, system change, as we try to conceptualize it on the AWEF, is a process of evolution of a market system. Reflect internally whether that evolution has been positive and that we have contributed to, has been positive and is something that we can claim as a project success. So it's really tailored ad hoc to each intervention that we implement. How we measure it specifically, and I mentioned earlier the 3 components, and let me maybe dive a little bit more into the informal rules. I mentioned earlier that to me, informal rules are what really keeps the system honest. And to explain, if let's say a bunch of businesses adopt a new practice that has been promoted by our project, if there isn't an informal recognition among the system that practice should be continued and should meet the needs of our target population, there could be an argument that that practice is not sustainable and is not ultimately transforming the system. So we try to look at expectations of behavior and social norms. what expectations are there among our target population, and we define them. Julia mentioned one earlier, for example, about the RMG sector in Egypt. Expectations among women employees in the garment sector, that garment factories provide a certain level of that don't verbally abuse staff anymore. That expectation of behavior, that slight early norms change, to us is a really critical informal rule that we track and that we want to see changing in the system.
Thank you, Adriano. Well, with that, we only have a couple more minutes. I know there were a few more questions, but I think we're going to have to skip to wrap up. But I just want to say thank you to the presenters. I think this was extremely insightful. I think some of these common themes of really seeing the private sector as an ally, and not only from a programming perspective, but also to really explore ways on, co-creating with them, even around data collection, what that means to actually monitor our impacts, and can really kind of dig deeper in terms of the types of data that we can collect with them from a research and longer term research perspective as well. But I also just want to highlight the whole aspect. I can't help myself just knowing that everyone on the call are also market systems practitioners, to really have a call out between thinking about this type of data and its links to systems change and the importance of that. And I think sometimes we overlook local actors for their role in this as well. And I think there's a lot of different ways, especially Julia pointed out some ways in Mozambique that we're doing this. Adriano's talking about it somewhat in the Middle East, and I know for Stephanie as well, that how we can actually work with local actors and local institutions to collect the types of data that help them also to understand the systems that we work in and create those feedback loops that really can strengthen the systems. So I think this aspect of informal rules and what that really means also has links to how the private sector understands consumer behavior, which I think there's a lot of interesting different ways to use that type of data to understand systems, but also help firms and different actors understand the work that they do. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mike, and thanks so much for everybody for joining us.